As you're joining us for this third session, we're just going to take a couple of minutes to let everyone get back into the room. Just for logistics, for those of you who have been with us the past two sessions, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to enter them directly into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure they go to the right person and get you an answer. And otherwise, we'll begin in just a moment here. All right, so if you're joining us for the first time, this is a session that's going to focus on worker ownership and worker control of workplaces, a potential institution that can, or an institutional design that can begin to broaden wealth in society. We're going to hear from a distinguished group of 4 panelists. I could spend the entire 45 minutes that we have on this session introducing them and giving you their backgrounds. Because of the time limits that we have, I'll just say please do read all about them on our website. The panelists by name are Andrew Del Monte from Cooperation Buffalo, the director, the council member David Rivera from the Niagara District of the City of Buffalo, State Senator Sean Ryan from the New York State 60th District, and Jonathan Johnson from Creighton Johnson and Giroux, an attorney, who's going to give us a lot of perspective on some of the corporate designs or the designs of the workplace and structures that we need to actually make worker-owned enterprises in New York State. So to begin, I'm going to ask, because we have 4 of us, I'm just going to jump right into questions, and I'm going to ask Andrew, if you wouldn't mind, to start off, just giving us an overview of what are worker cooperatives, how do they differ from conventional businesses, and what potential do they have for fighting economic inequality?
Sure. Thanks, Rusty. It's good to be with all of you today. So what is a worker cooperative? A worker cooperative is a type of cooperatively owned enterprise. And if folks are familiar with cooperatives, you might know that there are different kinds depending on the group of members that jointly own and operate the enterprise. So some of the more common cooperative structures, especially in the US, that folks might be familiar with are agricultural producer co-ops. We have upstate farms here in Western New York. We also have consumer-owned cooperatives that locally folks might be familiar with the Lexington Cooperative Market or the African Heritage Food Cooperative, where folks who consume the food at those grocery stores co-own the business together and make decisions about what they're going to sell and what prices they set. Worker-owned cooperatives is a cooperative model where the folks that jointly own and operate the enterprise are the workers, the employees of the business. They share decision-making power on a macro level from on a basis of 1 worker, 1 vote, and they'll also share in the profits of the business when there's surplus at the end of the year. When it comes to sort of uplifting this model in our communities, part of why we do this in Cooperation Buffalo is particularly, to borrow a phrase that I heard Rusty use in the first session today, it's targeted universalism for us, right? So we know that this is a model that is going to lift all boats of folks that work in businesses. It's going to get them better wages and benefits. It's going to lead to higher employee retention, even increased productivity. These are all things that have been documented for employee-owned businesses and worker co-ops in particular. But we focus most of our energy at Cooperation Buffalo on making sure that folks who are typically excluded from the mainstream economy have a first go at launching these businesses and lifting themselves up into ownership positions and also a chance to build wealth for their families. And for some of the folks that we work with, they haven't had a chance to own anything in their lives ever. So owning an asset, part of their business, is a big deal for them. And I'm forgetting the very last part of your question, Rusty, but I just wanted to uplift some of the examples of worker co-ops here in Buffalo and Western New York. We have very few currently, but we're growing that movement right now. We've got a childcare center on the west side called the Rose Garden. We have a bakery called Bread Hive and an aquaponic vertical farm called Cooperative, among a few others. And nationally, there's hundreds of these businesses in just about every sector. Any business can be worker-owned or employee-owned. And we'll get into a little bit more of that, I'm sure, when Jonathan talks about the structure side of things.
Sure, just a quick follow-up, Andrew, for you. You had mentioned that we do have relatively few worker-owned cooperatives here in Buffalo right now and really nationally as well. Can you give us a sense of why that is? Why are these businesses relatively scarce? And what are some of the unique challenges that prevent more co-ops from forming?
Well, I have my own theories about scarcity related to the, the sort of overarching American dream model where anybody can theoretically go from rags to riches in this country. And I think that perception, even though we know it's not the case for most of the folks in our communities to have those opportunities, sort of lets folks think that there's going to be an opportunity to step up into ownership quite easily just by pulling up their bootstraps, right? But we know that there's a lot of barriers to that happening to everyone. So why not create structures where everybody has a chance to build wealth collectively at these businesses and rise all ships together? I think some of the barriers for this model in the US and also here locally are pretty standard when you think about, something that is not well known. So one of the biggest issues with getting the word out about employee ownership and worker ownership are these aren't things that are typically talked about in the small business development or economic development spaces. And so I think just having more resources and more of the existing infrastructure with the skill sets and knowledge to support folks into these models will do a lot to sort of address that inequity.
Thank you. And so moving over to Jonathan, if you don't mind, just wondering sort of, where do worker cooperatives fit into New York State business law? So what forms can they take? And do you have any insights on legal structures in other states that are more amenable to cooperative formation, or are we doing it the right way here? I believe you're on mute, sir. Apologies.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me today. It's nice serving on a panel with having both people, educators, and people from the legislature also, because again, this is a multifaceted problem. New York State does have a worker cooperative statute. It was added a number of years ago. There was someone up at the law school, University of Buffalo, who ran a clinic up there, and he worked to get a worker cooperative statute kind of added to the cooperative corporation law. Corporation law has been in New York forever. It's actually got its own thin little book in the McKinney set, and I always tease that's why I majored in it, because it was the smallest book of law. So it really has been around for a long time. As Andrew explained, there's many different types of cooperatives under the statute, and now it includes a worker cooperative. Prior to the passing of the worker cooperative statute, if you knew what you were doing, you could take a normal business corporation and make it into a worker cooperative by the bylaws and by the certificate of incorporation. Some of the early co-ops in Buffalo that I represented, 30 years ago, were formed that way. They were operated under business corporation law as a worker cooperative. So again, it makes it a little easier now with the worker cooperative statute because it spells things out. But if you want to get creative, you can, if you know what you're doing. I want to just piggyback on a little bit of your earlier question, Rusty, and that is, what's the impediment? The impediment isn't the legal structure for the most part. I'll mention one thing. The impediment isn't not having expertise to do this stuff in Buffalo. It's the general consensus is not aiming people towards worker cooperatives. The difficult thing about a worker cooperative is everyone's being told, you start a business, you hire people, and you make a lot of money. The worker cooperative model is a bunch of workers get together and all make money together. It's not like one person getting ahead, and that's just not the American model. The way to think about worker cooperatives, which makes them really different than the standard model, is the workers hire capital, and if there's money left over at the end, they get it. The typical business model is capital hires workers, and if there's money left over at the end, the shareholders keep the money. And that's a hard switch to make. We've gone through periods in Buffalo where there's a bunch of cooperatives are formed, and then they kind of all go away. And now we're in the kind of a resurgence, which is great. But again, it hasn't reached a critical mass. I want to touch on one other legal structure, because I know this has been happening all over the country too. A parallel to worker cooperatives are worker ownership through what are called ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans. That's a form of taking the normal kind of business model of shareholders owning a corporation, except you divide up the stock among workers in the enterprise. there's kind of two different models of that. There's a democratic model where the workers actually get to vote, and there's a non-democratic model where it's kind of imposed on the workers, and they get very little rights. Both are tax advantaged, which is what drives ESOPs, and both are kind of heavily subsidized by the government. Again, a democratic ESOP has been shown, again, I'm not a social scientist or a researcher, but I believe they've been shown to be more productive, but they're also harder to impose. The last one I heard of happening in New York was in response to a union organizing drive down in Ithaca, and they're talking about, oh, you don't need a union, you need worker ownership, and we're gonna give you some shares of stock, and you can get rid of the union. That's not a good use of that model, even though that's tax subsidized for them to do that, and it's not illegal. So it's a kind of an interesting thing. But that's basically the legal breakdown. If I could set up someone at a worker cooperative in an afternoon. The problem is they have to go out there and they have to have a successful business, or they're not going to do it. The Lexington Co-op started out with people putting money in a shoebox, and they worked for 30 years, and now they have 2 stores in the city, thriving, paying workers well, delivering great food and good service, and it's a long haul.
So this is a question that is maybe a bit in the weeds for our opening. I do want to hear from everyone in just a moment, but since it came up, and since we're talking to you, we have a question in the Q&A about an LLCs. So it says that the LLC entity for worker co-ops is common in New York City. What are the pros and cons of using that particular structure? So
LLCs are more recent provided for in New York law, limited liability companies. They're very, very flexible. So just like I said, a business corporation can be kind of flexed to fit a worker model. An LLC is even easier to flex into a cooperative model. You don't really need to do it because New York, again, has it. I think why they're doing it probably in New York City is it's a more flexible form. You don't have to follow the statute. You can do whatever you want in an LLC. You could provide for partial worker ownership, partial non-worker ownership, and things like that. I had a group up in, I think, Plattsburgh, New York. We were working with having half the ownership with the workers and half the ownership with the consumers, and setting that up. And I did that as a cooperative, but we could have done it as an LLC or a business corporation.
Thank you. So I'll have some follow-ups for both you and Andrew in just a moment, because I think a lot of what you're saying is synergistic here and gets to some of the issues that we might see in sort of scaling out co-ops and making more of them inside of New York State. But before we get there, we'll just go to our partners in government for a moment. So Councilmember Rivera, I'm just interested to know, I know you were one of the council members that really got behind this idea of worker ownership several years ago. I think it was in 2014 when you co-sponsored a resolution that named worker cooperatives as this viable entity for pursuing more equitable development in the city of Buffalo. I'm just wondering, at the local level, what sorts of resources and relationships might there be if we were trying to pursue a strategy of expanding worker cooperatives locally? What sorts of, what do you think is available at the city level for this type of work?
Well, thank you, Rusty. You're right. Back in April of 2014, Councilmember Licurdo and myself sponsored a resolution recognizing the viable potential of worker co-ops for the various reasons that you mentioned here today, especially for employees to be able to have a stake in the decision and the work at all levels of a business. I thought was very positive. Since then, we have forwarded the information, the resolution, to our Office of Strategic Planning, which is the economic development arm of the city of Buffalo, to try to find out what can we do to help expand, grow, develop co-ops. We're not where we need to be right now in terms of government, in terms of a private public partnership between the city of government in terms of providing resources. I'd like to tell you that yes, there's $500,000 set aside in a loan program to help start up these co-ops. We're not there yet. I think it's going to take some convincing. The way, our development arm looks at it is that once these co-ops are formed, they can come to the city and apply like any other business that are out there. And I don't think they see the viability or the potential that's there for economic development in the city of Buffalo the way they look at other development organizations or entities. So it's a matter of persuading the administration along with the rest of the Common Council. Council member and I strongly believed in it. Former council member Licurdo, I even put a call to the county as well, try to figure out what, if anything, the ECIDA has for co-ops. And I'm waiting on a return call from the county itself. So hopefully we'll have more. I think that we have to create a support for it in city government and all levels of government for that matter, to see the viability and the potential for these co-ops and how we can expand them, not only in the city and the state and in the county as well. But I'm committed to doing that wherever I have an audience. I did speak with Brenda Mahaffey regarding the meeting that we're holding here today, and what can the city do to expand and develop these co-ops in the city of Buffalo, like we help and assist other organizations, even providing capital, which is probably one of the challenges the co-ops have early on, is having capital to begin a business. So it is something that we're looking at, that we're starting to speak to other levels of government as well. We've made calls to try to figure out what is out there that may be helpful to folks that want to begin these co-ops, businesses and entities that are out there that would like to begin these co-ops. But I understand the challenges that are out there. I mean, I've spent some time just looking at what are some of the good things that are happening, and then there are challenges. The number across the country is not as high, perhaps. And for whatever reasons, you probably know better than I do some of the challenges that these co-ops have in starting up. And I'd like to hear more how we can overcome those challenges that are out there. How can we get government engaged, be more helpful to these co-ops?
So that I think I appreciate that very much, because I think those are some questions that I'll pose to Andrew and Jonathan here in just a moment. Before I do, you did mention the issue of access to capital, and I think that's really one of the big issues here. Especially, we're in this era, and again, Andrew can probably speak better to this, but I believe we're about a decade away from 50% of business owners reaching retirement age, small business owners across the United States. And so there's this looming question of what's going to happen if those businesses are just put to sale on basically on the markets. Are they going to go into private equity firms? Are they going to go overseas, or are they just going to shut down? What are we going to do about the workers in these positions? And so one alternative that gets put out there a lot is we'll sell to the workers. But the workers often lack that capital, the startup money that would be necessary for those conversions to happen. So that's a question that I think we'll come back to for Andrew and Jonathan in just a moment. But since we're also on this topic of what can elected officials and governments at all levels do, I want to turn to State Senator Sean Ryan. Just like Councilmember Rivera, you've passed or put forward legislation to support cooperative developments previously when you were an assembly member. I believe one of the bills that you put forward was to impanel a statewide commission on employee ownership to figure out how we can expand employee ownership in New York State. So I'm just wondering if you might be able to give us an update on that committee, if it was ever seated, and what sorts of initiatives do you know about at the state level right now that are looking at the issue of employee ownership?
Rusty, I think it's one of these questions of everybody has this foggy notion that these are good ideas, but nobody has a really good idea of how to make it so. New York City's had this initiative to try to create more co-ops. I think honestly the jury's out on how successful that initiative is going to be. I think the largest place for co-ops in our future is the point that you just made, is that we have entrepreneurship class who want to sell out of their businesses. and they want to retire. So I view the future of co-ops, the biggest growth opportunity is actually trying to get a state equivalent of the federal employee stock option program, where the ESOP program is kind of out of reach for smaller companies because there's the initial cost of becoming an ESOP, which is quite complicated, and then there's the yearly maintenance cost. So what I'm trying to put my energy into is using co-ops as a way to keep capital in the places where that capital was grown. I give you an example. Russer Foods was a big food producer in Buffalo, hundreds of employees, Teamsters, good wages. Well, that family didn't want to own it anymore. They wanted to get into something else, so they sold it, and they sold it to the Tyson Corporation. And within 3 years, Tyson had stripped the company, taken all the labels, and closed down the company. So I think that would have been a perfect opportunity for an employee ownership program. Not creating something and then creating something as a co-op. I think that's I don't know how we can apply that at a large scale, but I think there's a big opportunity for taking existing businesses. Think of anything from a restaurant. Many people don't know, but the Jack's Oyster Bar on Grand Central, that's an employee-owned cooperative. And it's an employee-owned cooperative because the owners wanted to sell out. And the employees were afraid if they sold out that it won't be such a good boss. So they pooled their money together. Another company in Buffalo, sometimes people think of cooperatives as sort of a crunchy sort of endeavor, with candles and bees. But, Great Lakes Orthodontics is one of the largest producers of orthodontics in North America, and they're employee-owned. So, in the Bronx, we have, the Cooperative Home Care Association. It's a large, very big, 2,000 employees. Once again, it's cooperatively owned. And they weren't able to magically, increase wages or pay people a lot more money, but they had a much better work environment where, schedules were set more days in the future. People got better training. So I really view it as a way to maintain capital in your community that's already been invested, as original owners of companies are looking to essentially retire. So that's something I'm continuing to look at, but it would really be trying to create an ownership program under New York State that has a tax advantage, and the tax advantage would make it so it's, maybe we can secure the sale to the workers in case it falls through, because, owners don't want to sell a business that's sold and 18 months later have a default occur and have no liability anymore. Then they can't retire. So I think there's ways to look at it, but, that's my take on it. And I, very interested in learning more, but also hearing about, the use of a co-op model to buy current companies.
Thank you. And so I'll kick that back to Andrew, if you don't mind. So we do have, it seems here, this need to know more about what can be done. So if this is a useful model, whether it's a worker-owned cooperative or just some other form of employee ownership, ideally that has a democratic structure to it, how is it possible to expand this? Is access to capital the only issue? Is it the biggest one? What else are we facing, and what can be done about it in your experience?
Sure. Well, I want to definitely jump on the train that both Councilmember Rivera and State Senator Ryan mentioned about this. What do we do to support this transition question, right? And I think there's been an awful lot of work done at the national level by folks, including the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, which is essentially the national trade association for worker-owned businesses. Democracy at Work Institute and others, to really tackle this silver tsunami that some folks refer to it as, of retiring baby boomers that are, the owners of a lot of the micro businesses and small businesses in our neighborhoods and on our main streets right now, and what that transition is going to look like and could look like. And for most folks who live and work in these neighborhoods and have been the ones really that have kept these businesses running for a very long time as the workers, they're actually positioned to be the best buyers of a lot of these companies because they know how to keep them running. They know what's important to the customers, and it's really important to them and a big incentive to them to be able to own these workplaces and keep their jobs around, right? Rather than having them liquidated. So actually, in our current pipeline of some of the folks that we're working with, about half are those startups that Jonathan was referring to, where it's folks that are workers that are coming together around a business idea. They've got to prove out getting to break even and figuring out what their startup cash looks like. And that's a tall order. But the other half of the folks we're working with right now are small businesses that are having those conversations around retiring owners or owners that want to share the ownership model with the rest of the workers at the company. So I think this model, we call it conversions in the worker co-op world, really is taking hold. And there's some structures and particularly some modes of financing out there available. We're part of a national CDFI called Seed Commons that's able to provide capital specifically for worker co-op conversions. And there's less than a half dozen other cooperative lenders out there that are able to provide capital that works for these sorts of enterprises. They're not necessarily looking for personal guarantees, because when you have 20 owners of a business, how does a bank figure out who's personally guaranteeing what piece of the pie and things like that? So there's some options out there, but certainly more and more readily accessible capital for these transitions is something, or even just to the state senator's point, securing some of those loans, I think would go a long way toward ensuring that these transitions happen and happen at scale. One of the simplest things that they've done in the city of New York recently is to launch a city-sponsored hotline where owners can call who are considering retirement or not sure what their succession planning options are and be matched with some of the cooperative development organizations in New York City, just to talk to someone to kind of work through what this idea could be like. And even just that sort of the sponsorship and the sanctioning at the city economic development level, that this is a priority of ours, this is a way we think it can work really well for our communities, has gone a long way toward bringing a lot more of these conversions to the table, which I think is really exciting.
Yes, thank you. Jonathan, I'm wondering if you have any follow-up on this as well, based on your experience and working directly with co-ops that are trying to incorporate and form, and the challenges that you've seen. What are policy mechanisms that might make a difference in this process?
So let's talk about two different groups. Again, initial formation of worker cooperatives. I think it's education on how to do it. I can't tell you how many people at Buff State, or I said about Andrew now at Cooperative Buffalo, and say, listen, you don't need a lawyer. You need to figure out, how to run a business, right? You don't have a business plan. You don't have all those kind of things. So that's what it is that, and it's hard to start a business. We forget that, 2/3 of whatever it is, businesses fail within the first 3 years. So we can't expect that we can form 10 cooperatives and all 10 are going to be in business. That wouldn't fit, the economic system we have. I'd like to speak to Senator Ryan's idea. I think it's a great idea to support these conversions. Any package in the conversions, whether it's a federal tax or a state tax break, they go to the old owners, and that's very good. And the owners look to that because they're like, oh, this is great. It gives them a real big incentive. The problem is the other side of the equation is the workers and the people who have to organize the workers to actually buy, and they get no support. So what happens is you have a one-sided system where the people who are going to get the tax break do everything in their power to make it best for them, and the workers don't have a voice. And I'll give you an example. I was called one time by a grain miller president, a union president, and he said, listen, they're going to sell a grain mill, let's put a group together and let's buy it. And we started down that road. And what happened was we got, 6 months into it, he lost his election. He was no longer the union president, and it just went away because there was no one else to lead the charge on that side, right? So that becomes a problem. Andrew and I did a conversion where I actually represented the old owner who came to me. She had been a longtime client, a business client, and said, I want to sell to my workers. and Andrew represented the workers and helped them on their side. And they had that help, which was able to then match the owner side. But I had a very willing owner. She was willing to do whatever it took, and it was very hard. It was a hard process. So without some kind of funding to help that whole process, I think that's the issue, because I think the capital's there. I help co-ops raise capital. Lexington Co-op, we put out a call to the community to buy capital shares and loans in the co-op. We raised $2.5 million in a very short period of time. There's money there to be invested if you know how to do it, which is what I help a lot of co-ops do. But again, there's not money to pay, Andrew to help, or to pay me to do it on the worker side. So just when you're thinking about legislation, that would be my suggestion or for funding, that's the funding that's needed that could come from government, because the owners have funding and they have money and they have capital. The workers don't, and they need to be educated, or else they're going to get taken advantage of. And it's lots of literature on it, Senator Ryan, on how the ones that are more democratic and get the workers involved are more productive and successful than the ones that are just used to get a tax credit. And I want to make one more point to Council Member Rivera. Your point was very good. These co-ops, I've been encouraging them to try to take advantage of what's out there. So for instance, I'm doing a project down in Springville where they're using they're selling tax credits. They're actually doing a project and realizing they don't need the tax credits. They're a not-for-profit, they're a worker co-op. Who needs the tax credits? So they're selling them. And they were very successful. We did a public offering of tax credits to support the not-for-profit project, and it's going to have a worker-owner cooperative part of it. So that's we're trying to do that. So thank you.
Very interesting.
Can I jump in, Rusty?
Please, yes.
So I'd like to get more information, from Andrew or Jonathan about the specific types of programs. I followed a conversion in the Adirondacks recently, Ward's Lumber and Hardware. It's a very old business that was, frankly, the owners wanted to make a change, but they were able to do that through a couple different grants, and one was through New York State's Empire State Development Program. But maybe we could work together to come up with some ideas on making sure there's a New York State tax advantage, but also to make sure that there's a pool of money. So I think the Empire State Development money that was used for Ward's Lumber, it was a discretionary. Like somebody came to the Empire State saying, "I have a good idea," and they did it, as opposed to saying, "Here's a pool of money for this purpose. Go out and find deals and provide some of the backstopping that Jonathan has mentioned is often not there and could lead to these being done just for let's say nefarious tax reasons, as opposed to keeping the business in the community."
Right. And also just Senator Ryan, just also because it's a harder process. So it's easy, you're swimming upstream. So if the owner decides to do this, they get the tax advantage, but then their lawyers and accountants are telling them, yeah, that's that. But if you do it this way, it's a lot easier.
Yeah,
just do it this way.
Yeah, I still look at this market of like Ward's Lumber, like the owners wanted not to own the store anymore, and they could have sold it to like an Ace Hardware that probably would have closed it because they have another store 20 miles away.
Right.
So I view it as there's capitalism in here because we're going to allow the owner to cash out, but
Correct.
we want those years and years of capital investment to stay in our community. I'm sure Ward's had a book of business with distributors and roofers, and if you start from scratch, it's going to take you years to get there. Right?
Yep, exactly.
Close by, you can visualize Buffalo machine shops with 40 people, and a older owner whose kids went to college and are work in New York City, and often the succession plan is hoping that you live forever, or this idea that you're adult child is going to stop working in Wall Street and move back home to run a machine shop. So usually the first thing that happens when that happens is someone brings in a real estate broker to figure out how much is a building worth, and then bring in somebody else to figure out how what's the equipment's worth, because the book of business is irrelevant because they can't use it. I see Andrew nodding along this one because I think you may have seen this before. But I really think if we can develop programs to actually go out and talk to business owners who are about succession planning, and how selling it to your workforce is a viable way to make it so your business makes it through and will allow you to retire.
Yeah, exactly right. And also maybe an outreach program as part of that, not only to the business owners, but to people, to the workers in those kind of places, and let them know it's an option, because they might be able to talk the boss into it if they knew about these things.
So I'm going to shift gears quickly here. We have a little under 10 minutes left, and we've been talking a lot, rightly so, about what it takes to develop and scale up more co-ops. I want to turn the focus right now to the ones that already do exist and how it's possible to strengthen them and make them more viable. And so in our last session on economic development, we had an elected official and an organizer and nonprofit leader talking about some of the pitfalls with the way that we do economic development subsidies right now and the way that we support traditional businesses, conventional businesses, and make it easier for them basically to get access to capital and expand or relocate somewhere. Now, I'm wondering, to what extent can economic development subsidies that we're already using be either earmarked or dedicated to worker cooperatives, almost in terms of even local government contracting. So we give priority, rightly so, again, to women and minority-owned businesses. To what extent, maybe Councilmember Rivera, this one is directed at you a bit, to what extent would the city be able to change its procurement practices or its economic development subsidy practices to dedicate some percentage of contracts or give priority preference to firms that are worker-owned and democratic?
Well, I think there has to be a change in mindset to begin with. The city's approach to economic development is developer, a business person comes in with a plan, projections. Everything is all set for them. The city doesn't have to do anything, just make a decision whether or not to fund them. And so the city is looking for people that are ready to go to do business right away. So we have to change that mindset and attitude with regards to co-ops. Co-ops, like we mentioned before, they don't have the expertise. They rely on consultants. They rely on attorneys. They rely on folks like some of the people that are here today to steer them through all that. And that is costly for them. Upfront, that is very costly. So they're at a disadvantage. Those are some of the challenges, some of the hurdles they have to overcome, not only in this level of government. I imagine perhaps in other levels of government, including the county. If you go before the CIDA, you probably have to have certain information. So these co-ops are at a disadvantage. And far as incentives that the city can provide to them, I think we have to do a better job of letting them know what types of incentives are out there that other developers are aware of. And developers, any developer worth his salt has consultants that tell you where to go to get it, where to find it, under what rocks. So that's a disadvantage that these co-ops have. We have to figure out a way to educate them, to make sure they know where to go for these incentives, to know that just like the other developers that are privately enterprise, know where to go and get them, that they themselves know that they're entitled by right to those same benefits. That I learned through talking to Brenda Mahaffey. So they're entitled to the same benefits that these private businesses have, the sole proprietor businesses have. They're entitled to them. So they need to understand that they're entitled to them. It's the question is how to go after them, have the people on board to help them, to steer them through all that. That is very expensive. That's why we talked about having some resources up front to help them begin this process. And I think that would help them to motivate them to follow through, because it takes a lot of patience, a lot of time, a lot of expertise to do this, just like in any other business. I imagine co-ops would be just as much.
Thank you. We're down to about 4 minutes. So Andrew, I want to pose almost the same question to you. So to what extent can local and state governments provide preference in contracting or procurement services to make sure that worker co-ops or democratically owned workplaces are maybe getting some sort of added support in terms of doing extra business? And then, because we're low on time, I'm going to blanket this question out there for everyone. It's my standard end question. Andrew, I know in particular you have something exciting coming up. So please tell us where to find you on the internet, what you're working on, if there's anything that you want to plug and make our audience aware of. After Andrew's final response here, we can go through and ask everyone that same question.
Be brief so we can go around. The procurement question is one that comes up a lot when folks in the worker co-op world are considering tangible ways for municipal governments to be able to support these businesses, because we're talking about revenue streams, right? And while it is true that this is I think a fascinating fact that in the worker co-op world in the US, a vast majority, nearly 2/3 of workers in these businesses are people of color. Nearly 2/3 are women, right? So these are businesses that are already meeting a lot of the same guidelines as we see procurement policies with the MBE and WBE structures in place. But it can be a lot harder for these democratically owned businesses to certify that the ownership is at least 51%, because folks come and go at these businesses so frequently, right? So do they need to recertify every single time a worker leaves the business and another one comes into co-ownership? And so I think there are maybe some more direct ways to consider if this, in addition to just having more businesses that are women-owned and minority-owned, but if also having this broad-based community ownership, if having a social mission at your company, are also things that cities or municipalities want to uplift as these are the values that we want our contracts to be going toward. I certainly think there could be some models to rewrite some of the procurement statutes to include those more explicitly that would help these worker-owned businesses be able to access those existing structures even easier, right? Because if it's just by virtue of being worker-owned and community-owned that there's broad-based community ownership, that there's a way for them to access those programs, that would be wonderful. What we've got coming up soon. So I didn't really, explain too much about what Cooperation Buffalo was at first. We're a small nonprofit program, 2.5 staff, dedicated to, I wear 2 hats, community organizing to let folks know about worker ownership and economic democracy as a model, and then also the technical assistance to actually get these businesses started. So we've got a program coming up next Saturday, May 22nd, called Worker Co-op Jumpstart in the afternoon. It's going to be a series of workshops over the course of 4 hours, just in, how this is rooted in movements for social justice, racial justice, economic justice, and then also some of the early building blocks for anyone who's interested in this model to take some things away, have some work to do with maybe teammates, maybe to have some conversations with their coworkers about taking over their workplaces if their owner's thinking about retiring. So that's going to be a really fun event, and I encourage folks to sign up. It's free. Our website is cooperationbuffalo.org. We're also Cooperation Buffalo on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks, Rusty.
Thank you. Senator Ryan, you're next on my screen up there. So if you have any final thoughts or comments for our audience on this topic, as well as any initiatives that you have going on that might not be completely related to this event, but that you'd like to put out there.
Well, I think the idea of ownership of companies and how we do it is, we're at the tip of the iceberg now, but we're going to have to develop policies that encourage this to happen. We look at how our current economy is structured, and that didn't just happen. It happened because there were a set of rules and regulations in place that created it. So, the economy is not like the weather. It doesn't just happen. It happens because of the rules that we create. So I think we have an opportunity to redefine ownership, but it's going to take a lot of brain power. But it's also the brain power that we're often don't sort of the field we don't run in. It's really understanding taxation, understanding finance. So we need to sort of take part of our brains that say, let's make a more just society, and merge it with how do we understand the current capital structure. So we need to do both, but I'm looking forward to continuing to work on this issue. And then also, Rusty, to reform as much as we can possibly the absolutely broken and wasteful economic development programs that we have on all levels of New York State government. But thanks for hosting this, and thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Rivera, same questions.
Well, thank you. We receive quite a bit of funds from state government and other levels of government. And I think we should be incentivized to help co-ops, owner co-ops, that it would incentivize the city to do more than what it's doing. Because right now, municipalities across the state, and even counties for that matter, are not pushing this this agenda or this priority that we feel strongly about, and we need them to help us, to help other people. On the Common Council, there are a few members that support this, and the rest perhaps don't know as much. I'm certain that if they were at events like this, they would be more inclined to support it themselves. So I think there's a lot of information that has to go out there, develop support for this, but we also need to encourage the city wherever we can to be a partner in this as well.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Johnson, you're last on my screen to the right. Any final thoughts for our audience? Anything that you want to make the audience aware of? Please feel free.
I do. I just want to bring up a story from Buffalo, I think, that shows some of the issues that develop, again, in the interaction between government and these kind of developments. As we know, in the east side of Buffalo, we did not have a supermarket. And so many years ago, there was a lot of talk about how we got to get a supermarket over in this food desert on the east side. The Lexington Co-op, didn't have the wherewithal at the time to move over there with a second branch as it's done recently. But a group formed, and it was called Our Market. And they got a grant from the city. I think it was about $50,000. They had exploratory stuff. They had plans drawn up. They hired me. We were going forward with the whole project. But as I said earlier, it's a very difficult process, right, to do this. And of course, it was easier for the city, and I don't know who was even involved in any of the decisions, but I think it was easier for the city eventually to convince Tops to open up a new market over there, which they did in the same spot that Our Market was going to be. So, I don't know which is, that might be fine, and they might be doing really well, but that's still reinforcing our old kind of economy, because, Tops, they're going to operate the way they operate. They're going to have minimum wage jobs. They're going to do everything they can to keep the development on the low road. Our Market, they might have failed, but at least they would have been trying to have a high road development, and we would have learned something from that project. But the city, again, didn't want to throw money at it. It's a success, and again, no offense to the politicians that are on this call, a success is much better to tout. When you're cutting the ribbon in front of the new Tops market, you get a lot of credit. When when Our Market is failing or collapses, that's not as good. So I think the risk aversion needs to be addressed somehow, and maybe it's with a big capital fund that you say, hey, guess what? We have to start 10 of these in every, in Syracuse, in Binghamton, in Albany, all the places that need something. We need to just go out and spend the money. And if it doesn't work, someone said in the earlier thing, it was $1.2 million per job. I know if you gave me that for one of my worker co-ops, we'd have 10 jobs for 10 years on that amount, and build a much better economy for Buffalo. So with that, I'll end. I don't have any projects going on. People come to me for help every day from a different co-op, and that's what I do. I love it. So thank you very much for having me.
Well, I'm very glad that you just happened to be at the end of my screen, because that's a perfect story for us to end on. That's the point of this summit and getting folks together to discuss these issues, is these are the types of outcomes that happen if we don't figure out ways to take actions and do things differently. So my eternal gratitude and thanks to all four of you. I really do wish that this panel could have gone on much longer, because there's so much more I imagine that the four of you could say. But thank you so much for being here and taking the time to be with us this morning on a Friday. Thank you to all of the audience members who participated in this session and any of the others. It's been great having you. Hopefully we can get together and do this again next year. Thank you all so much. Take care.